The friendship between two major icons, Brad Pitt and George Clooney, has long been regarded as an almost perfect model in the glamorous world of Hollywood. Brad once personally witnessed George declare that he would remain single for the rest of his life after enduring too many emotional wounds in his past relationships. Yet life took an unexpected turn when George met Amal, a turning point that left the entire world in awe, like a fairy tale suddenly appearing in real life. However, behind the radiant smiles and seemingly perfect moments, Brad clearly understands that there are still deep cracks that the spotlight cannot conceal. And only today has he found the courage to reveal the hidden corners of Clooney and Amal's marriage. "People only see the spotlight," Brad said softly, but George Clooney has gone through things no one could ever imagine. He also revealed the presence of a mysterious third figure intervening in this relationship, a truth that, if exposed, would shake all of Hollywood. So how will this secret change George Clooney's image in the eyes of the public? And what is the real story behind that seemingly perfect marriage? Let's uncover the entire truth in this video. The journey begins with the profound friendship between these two legendary men. No one would have thought that in a Hollywood overflowing with lights, but lacking sincerity, two individuals with completely different personalities could find each other like perfectly matched pieces arranged by fate. Brad Pitt and George Clooney met on the set of Ocean's 11, a moment that seemed ordinary, but actually marked the beginning of a friendship that would later earn the admiration of all of Hollywood. On the first day, Clooney teased Pitt with a half-joking remark, "I hear you're the most handsome guy on set." Pitt simply smiled, shrugged, and replied, "Let's see by the end of the day who gets booed more." That seemingly casual exchange marked the start of a journey that would last more than 2 decades. From that very moment, a special connection between them ignited like a spark catching fire. Just standing next to each other was enough to make the entire crew burst into laughter, and whenever they pulled pranks, everyone could only wait to see how far the Pitt and Clooney show would go. Brad once plastered fake sexiest man alive posters of George all over Rome just to tease him, while George retaliated by sending a funeral wreath with the message, "My condolences on the loss of Brad Pitt's looks." At Cannes, in 2007, they danced like 16-year-old boys, and behind the scenes of Burn After Reading, George once shouted, "You're the worst actor I've ever met, but I still don't want to act with anyone else." Behind those jokes was something both genuine and impossible to fake. But beneath the laughter lay a much deeper emotional current so profound that the media called them the most enduring friendship in Hollywood. They didn't just share the spotlight, they also stood shoulder to shoulder during moments others would usually avoid. When Brad sank into the turmoil of his divorce in 2016, George was the only one who let himself into Brad's house without any prior notice. When George faced the anxiety of becoming a father at the age of 56, Pitt sent him an XXL adult diaper, along with a note that made everyone laugh. "Get ready, old man. It's your turn to cry." It is these quiet gestures that cannot be faked. Pitt once said that George is the person he calls when everything falls apart, because George sees the whole chessboard, not just the pieces in front of him. And Clooney, who always uses humor to hide his wounds, found support in Pitt, one of the very few people who truly understands the exhaustion behind his optimistic exterior. These two men who seem invulnerable actually carry many fractures within, and they have healed together over the years. What amazes people is not that they are close, but how they have maintained that friendship for nearly 25 years in an environment where betrayal can happen faster than a camera flash. No jealousy, no rivalry, no ego. Only a rare level of trust that keeps them in the habit of calling each other every week, even as work and schedules pull them in different directions across the world, because they have gone through so many hardships together. Failed marriages, scandals, and stumbles that the public has never witnessed. Brad Pitt has become an irreplaceable witness in George Clooney's life. He understands every fear, every wound, every secret that George has hidden behind the smile of a movie star. And now Brad Pitt is ready to reveal everything that remains. Each layer of glamour will be peeled away. The love story that once captivated all of Hollywood will be turned upside down, exposing the cold truth buried deep within the heart of a marriage that once seemed unbreakable. To understand that collapse, we must return to the very beginning, looking back at the most beautiful moments when Clooney, the man who once swore to remain single for life, stood beside the woman who made the entire world believe he had changed. Their appearances together in Venice, the gentle glances, the photos that made people believe in destiny, all of it once shone like a dream. But perhaps that very dream was also the most fragile thing of all. Before meeting Amal, George Clooney was considered one of the most charming bachelors in Hollywood, a man admired by many, yet one who did not believe in marriage or family, at least not until he met the woman who would change his entire life. George had once declared that he would never marry, that he would live freely unbound by any responsibilities. He once told me, "I don't need anyone, I'm fine on my own," Brad recalled in a low voice, as if reminiscing about a chapter of his close friend's life that was both dazzling and lonely. That was no coincidence. George had gone through many relationships, from high-profile romances with Elisabetta Canales and Renee Zellweger to Jennifer Siebel Newsom. He had been married once in the late 1980s to actress Talia Balsam, but that marriage lasted only a few years before ending in 1993. George admitted that he himself was the one who broke it, because at the time he was not ready for a long-term commitment. After that marriage, he candidly told his friends, "I've never met anyone who made me want to give up my freedom." During that period, George made a promise to himself: no marriage, no children, no letting his heart be tied down. For him, being single was not just a lifestyle choice, but a declaration of how he wanted to control his life completely, freely, and entirely on his own terms. He even joked that his longest relationships only existed in the form of gifts or fleeting memories, never crossing into anything truly serious. Then Amal appeared. To Brad, that moment was like a sudden flame igniting in the darkness. George, the man who had sworn to remain single, suddenly changed. From his eyes to his gestures to his smile, everything was different. I had never seen him like that before. Brad sighed softly. He truly had changed. Brad understood that this was not just a passing romance, but the first time George had truly fallen in love with all his heart, which he had kept locked away for so many years. Brad still clearly remembers a summer night in 2013 when George returned from Lake Como with a look Brad had not seen since his youth, both confused, happy, and afraid. "I think I've met someone," Brad George admitted. Pitt laughed and asked, "You mean a woman you didn't immediately run away from?" In that very moment, Brad realized that everything had changed. Brad said that before Amal, no one had ever truly made George stop. No one was strong enough to step into his world without being consumed by fame. But Amal, a human rights lawyer who dedicated her life to justice, left George stunned in an entirely different way. She didn't care about Hollywood, didn't pay attention to flashing cameras, and had not even watched his films. And that was exactly what captivated George. From that moment on, George began writing long emails, pages at a time, just to find excuses to talk to her. "I'm like a 15-year-old boy," George told Brad, both shy and happy. Brad simply smiled quietly because he knew his friend had truly been struck by love at first sight. When they officially started dating in London, Brad was the first person George called in the early hours of the morning. "I think I'm done for," Clooney sighed over the phone. Brad asked, "What did you do? Say something wrong?" "Ruin the date," George replied, his voice full of confusion. "No. I like her too much." For a man known for his free and unattached lifestyle, that was almost the most serious confession George had ever made. And Pitt understood his friend's fear all too well, the fear of not being good enough, fear of age, and fear that this love was greater than anything he had ever known how to hold on to. That is why Brad was happier than anyone when he heard that George proposed to Amal in April 2014. Once again, he witnessed a completely different version of his friend. Nervous, clumsy, yet so sincere it was deeply moving. George said he had been on one knee for nearly 30 minutes because Amal was so surprised she could not answer right away. Brad joked kneeling that long without cramping would be a miracle. George laughed in relief and said, "I only knew one thing. I wasn't going to stand up until she said yes." For Brad, that was the first time he saw George place his entire heart in a woman's hands. Their wedding in Venice in 2014 left all of Hollywood almost speechless. But for Brad, what touched him most was not the star-studded guest list or the lavish extravagance, but the moment George stood before Amal, his eyes red with emotion, like a man who had finally found a place he had never believed he deserved. Pitt stood behind him, hearing his friend whisper, "I've waited a long time for you." And despite having lived through countless roles, Brad could never forget that face, a George Clooney who had stripped away all glamour to become simply a man in love. After their marriage, George Clooney once told the press, "We've never argued. No one wins, so why fight?" Their relationship unfolded quietly but deeply. They didn't preserve their marriage through arguments, but through understanding and patience. The silence between them was not empty. It held an entire world of love and respect. Then in 2017, when Amal was pregnant with twins as usual, Brad was the one who received the midnight call. George panicked, his voice full of disorientation. "I'm going to be a father, 2 kids." At the same time, "Brad, I'm 56 years old." Pitt laughed so hard he nearly choked on his drink, then reassured him, "You'd better start practicing sleeping while standing up." Brad witnessed George transform from a man afraid of commitment into a devoted husband, a father humbled before his 2 children, and a man who still wrote handwritten letters to his wife, even when they were half a world apart. "I've never seen him like that," Brad admitted. "There's a part of George that only Amal could ever reach." But George and Amal's marriage was not built only on glamorous appearances in public. Behind that, there were darker corners that not everyone knew about. The year 2017 brought happiness when their twins Ella and Alexander were born, but at the same time, it also brought an overwhelming pressure that no privilege could hide. George, at 56, admitted that he had never imagined he would become such an older father. Amal was busy with major legal cases, stepping into high-pressure courtrooms, while he was constantly traveling for film shoots. All of it made the pace of life increasingly relentless, tightening around them. Brad Pitt observed George and Amal Clooney's marriage from a distance close enough to understand, yet far enough to notice the cracks that sometimes even the people involved do not want to face. Since they had children, he saw them juggling private flights, constantly moving between Lake Como, London, Los Angeles, and Manhattan. Those luxurious homes that once seemed so solid gradually became reminders that stability is sometimes only a beautiful illusion. The distance did not begin with arguments, but crept in through moments when they were no longer truly fully present with each other. Amal appeared less and less at major Hollywood events, while George could not attend her important speeches at the United Nations. Their dates by the water in Italy, once filled with laughter, became fewer and farther between. Just by looking at George's eyes, whenever someone asked, "Are you two still okay?" Brad already understood that the real answer was not in that polite smile. Once in the makeup room, George sighed and murmured, "Maybe I'm slowly losing the most precious thing I've ever had." Brad simply placed a hand gently on his shoulder and said, "You haven't lost anything yet, unless you let go yourself." In Brad's eyes, Amal was a woman moving at the urgent pace of responsibility. She traveled between human rights case files, tense international meetings, and moments that could change other people's destinies. George, meanwhile, drifted in the rhythm of flashbulbs, red carpets, and premieres that ran late into the night. Those 2 worlds were each beautiful in their own way, but they rarely intersected. And so little by little, the invisible distance widened day by day, like a silent crack beneath a glossy coat of paint. When their schedules pulled them to opposite sides of the globe, distance was no longer measured only in kilometers. It was the evenings when Amal sat alone in a brightly lit room, quietly reviewing case files. The nights when George finished shooting at 3 in the morning, then realized his wife's missed call was still sitting on his phone. At first, they were only small silences, but then they grew into questions no one wanted to face. "Why aren't you here? Why didn't you come with me? When will we be together again?" On quiet evenings, as still as the lake at the villa in Italy. Brad silently watched them from afar, as if rewatching an old film whose ending he already knew. George and Amal sat beside each other, but no longer in the way of two people who once whispered everything to one another between candlelight and the soft clink of glasses. There were no more jokes that made the whole dinner table burst into laughter, no more accidental glances meeting and then softening. In their place were slow, cautious conversations, as if every word had been weighed in advance. One night, Amal mentioned a project in Geneva, her voice light but distant. George smiled, but Brad could see it clearly. That smile no longer reached his eyes. The moment that made Brad feel his heart tighten happened at his chateau in France, where friendship and wine should have kept everything safely in place. George and Amal arrived, but not together. A detail so small that outsiders might miss it. But for Brad, someone who had lived through heartbreak, it was the first sign of a real fracture. As they stepped into the courtyard, Brad saw it clearly. They were like two planets that had drifted out of their original orbit, still radiant, still captivating, but no longer close enough to hold on to each other. The affectionate gestures of the past had now been replaced by polite distance. Questions like, "Are you okay?" and "Are you tired?" sounded more like duty than genuine concern. Brad did not need anyone to explain it. He had lived through that feeling before, when a relationship slowly breaks apart piece by piece and no one is brave enough to admit it. The more he watched, the more he saw Hollywood's shadow slipping into every crack. This place turns closeness into a performance, turns a touch of the hand into something for the public to analyze. It distorts real emotion, forcing people to live according to the expectations of outsiders. The media was like a hungry beast waiting for the scent of blood. All it took was Amal missing a film premiere or George not showing up at a United Nations conference, and the press would inflate it into a tragedy. A photographer once captured a moment of Amal turning her face away on the red carpet, and by the next morning, all of Hollywood was buzzing that their marriage was about to collapse. "They don't understand," Brad sighed. "Sometimes it's just a tired blink, not a sign of the end." One night, when Brad and George were sitting alone on the terrace, Brad said softly, almost in a whisper, "Hollywood doesn't kill love. It just makes you forget how to love like a normal person." George stayed silent for a long time before replying, "I just don't want to do wrong by her, but I'm not sure anymore that I'm doing it right." The most painful thing was that there was no single fateful day that made everything fall apart. There was no shouting, no explosive outbursts of anger. It was just hundreds of small moments quietly wearing them down. A delayed text reply, a missed flight, an evening sitting side by side but feeling like strangers. And yet in the middle of all that chaos, what made Brad respect George most was the way he faced the storm of rumors. When Hollywood began to whisper, when the press continuously splashed headlines like "Clooney separated or Amal leaves," George did not deny anything, did not speak out to argue, nor did he blame anyone. He chose silence as if trying to shield Amal from the scrutinizing gaze of the world. And when he was forced to say something, he simply shared gently that his time with Amal had been the most beautiful period of his life and that they would always raise their children together. But what is meant to come will eventually come. From vague rumors that no one initially believed, everything gradually spread. It wasn't just about packed schedules or the pressure of fame, there was something else. Another shadow. Or more precisely, someone had quietly stepped in between them. Brad noticed it through the smallest details, the way George seemed distant when a certain name was casually mentioned, the way he avoided questions, the fleeting confusion on the face of a man once known as a master at concealing his emotions. One evening, while the group was talking, George suddenly grew quiet. Brad asked, "What are you thinking about?" George only replied softly, "There are a few things I don't know how to explain." In that moment, Brad saw a flicker of uncertainty that in 25 years of knowing him, he had never witnessed before. All of Hollywood began to buzz. People in the industry more sensitive to drama than any predator could all sense one thing: George Clooney's mind no longer seemed to be in the same place as his heart. And then the most frightening question. The one that felt like a dull blade twisting deep into Brad's chest began to be whispered backstage and at every private party, who had entered George Clooney's orbit. And what would that presence do to his seemingly unshakable marriage? Brad understood that when the truth came to light, it would not only stun Hollywood, it would change everything. In truth, it all began with a quiet but enduring friendship behind the scenes between George Clooney and Julia Roberts. That friendship first sparked in 2000 on the set of Ocean's 11, where instead of keeping their distance like two major stars, they found a rare sense of connection. That year, George Clooney first saw Julia Roberts walk into the script reading room with a radiant smile that seemed to light up the entire space. He was holding a cup of coffee while she carried the Ocean's 11 script in her hands. George immediately came up with an icebreaker. "I hear you get paid $20 million per movie, so I brought $20, consider it an advance." Julia burst into laughter, her voice echoing as everyone in the room turned to look. In that very moment, they knew they had found a perfect frequency with each other. Clooney, who called himself the king of pranks, had finally met a worthy opponent in Julia, a woman who never backed down to anyone. On set, they were like two mischievous children in adult bodies. Crew members often became their unsuspecting victims, while their laughter chased away the exhaustion of long shooting days. It wasn't acting, it was a rare connection in a world filled with pretense. Amid dazzling press conferences and the witty remarks George often used to mask his true feelings, there was one thing he never denied. His friendship with Julia Roberts came naturally, without force or calculation. They entered each other's lives through Ocean's 11 as if they had known each other forever, then continued side by side through Ocean's 12 Confessions of a Dangerous Mind Money Monster and Ticket to Paradise. To the public, they were simply two A-list stars capitalizing on a winning formula. But to those who looked deeper, they were two kindred spirits leaning on each other in an industry full of turbulence. In front of the cameras, they bantered, joked, and exchanged lines that were half teasing, half charming, the kind of chemistry that fascinated the media. But what kept them close was not the smiles in front of the lens, but the unseen moments, private conversations. Only they understood jokes that lasted for decades, and even the silences when one of them had to face pain that Hollywood preferred to ignore. Then, in 2014, Clooney surprised the world by announcing his marriage to Amal, a brilliant, intelligent human rights lawyer completely removed from Hollywood's superficiality. Even after getting married, George frequently invited Julia to his home by Lake Como, as if welcoming a member of the family. Julia was comfortable enough to walk barefoot, sip wine on the steps, and tease him during sunlit afternoons. The Clooney children called her Juju, and Amal also treated Julia like a sister who brought warmth and laughter whenever she appeared. That relationship extended beyond just the two of them. It reached everyone they loved. 3 years later, George became the father of two little angels, and from that point on, everything began to change. His once free-spirited life gave way to responsibility. Transcontinental flights were replaced by sleepless nights beside a crib. Julia watched it all from afar, both happy for her friend and worried about the fragility of a world she understood better than anyone. Julia herself had gone through dark periods of fame-failed films, crushing expectations that could break a person. And Clooney had always been there behind her, lifting her up with compliments that were both sincere and humorous, as if laughter alone could dispel every doubt. Julia never hid that George is my favorite co-star. It was not a polite remark, but a confession from a grateful heart. They understood each other through a language only those who had stood at the very top could feel: loneliness, fragility, and the exhaustion of constantly protecting the image Hollywood had built for them. George trusted Julia in a way he rarely did with others. He shared things with her he had never wanted to say publicly: unfinished relationships, suffocating nights, and the moments when he had to negotiate with his own heart. Then in 2021, when the pandemic forced Julia to be away from her family for 6 months in Australia while filming Ticket to Paradise, she fell into a loneliness unlike anything she had ever experienced. George didn't say much. He simply booked tickets for his entire family to fly over along with Amal and their two children. They turned the film set into a small village, evenings spent eating pizza together, the kids running everywhere, and Julia holding Alexander and Ella before eventually falling asleep on the sofa. But Hollywood has never spared anyone, not even the most beautiful friendships. When rumors about Clooney's marriage began spreading like a crack that could no longer be hidden, Julia's name was immediately dragged in, as if the media always needed a villain to complete the story. They kept asking questions. Did she know something? Was she involved? Or was she simply another victim in Hollywood's impulsively fabricated narratives? Whatever the truth was, their friendship was placed under relentless scrutiny with no mercy. And then, little by little, everything became clear when Brad Pitt spoke up. Only recently did Brad truly realize what he had unintentionally overlooked for years, what George Clooney had skillfully hidden behind polished smiles, sharp jokes, and a calm demeanor admired by the world. It had existed quietly, slipping through fleeting, furrowed brows, through the way George's voice would lower ever so slightly whenever he mentioned Julia Roberts. And looking back, Brad suddenly saw those pieces forming a picture that sent a chill through him. George had quietly developed feelings for someone he should not have Julia Roberts. One evening by Lake Como, Brad sat across from George under the soft yellow glow of an Italian ceiling lamp. They drank and chatted idly until George suddenly fell silent. His gaze no longer met Brad's, but drifted toward the half-open window where the night blended into the still black surface of the lake. "You know what the scariest thing is?" George said, his voice low as if falling into empty space. Brad asked, "What is it?" George answered softly, "I think there are some connections that never disappear, no matter how deeply you try to bury them." At the time, Brad did not understand. But just a few weeks earlier, during a promotional photo shoot, when he saw George's expression change, at the mere mention of Julia's name, Brad suddenly understood everything. He understood because he had felt that way himself before, the look in a man's eyes when he carries a secret he does not even dare to face. From the moment he realized it, Brad began viewing every small action of George's through a different lens. The way George laughed a little longer than usual when talking about Julia, the long silences after looking back at photos of the two of them taken over the years. And what confused Brad most was the feeling that Julia was the only person who made George see himself just like those seemingly casual remarks George had once made, but which now carried a hidden truth. On another evening, as the two of them stood on a balcony overlooking the glittering lights of New York City, George spoke in a hesitant voice, as if afraid that each word might betray him. "There are some people. When you're with them, you feel like you don't have to perform anymore." Brad asked, half joking, half serious, "Julia, right?" George froze just for a split second, but long enough for Brad to hear the answer that did not need to be spoken. George smiled and dodged it. "I said there are some people I didn't say who, but Pitt understood, and George knew that Pitt understood." The conflict inside George was not only about vague feelings for Julia, but also about the fear that if he admitted it, even in a seemingly harmless sentence, everything he had worked so hard to preserve would collapse: his family, his wife and children, his reputation. Brad saw in George's eyes a very specific kind of fear, the fear of loving the wrong person at the wrong time. Since realizing that Brad had begun to see George and Julia's relationship differently, their unusual chemistry, the unconscious, touches on the shoulder, the way they burst into laughter from a single glance, all of it carried a deeper meaning. Julia made George softer, younger, and more genuine. Amal, meanwhile, made George become a better, calmer, more proper version of himself. The man who had once symbolized freedom now seemed like a lost child in the middle of emotions too big and too complicated to name. Lately, every time George opened up to Brad, he would stop halfway through his sentences. It was always unfinished words. "I'm afraid," George once said, then fell silent, gripping his wine glass tightly. Afraid of what Brad asked. George only shook his head and sighed. Afraid of hurting people who don't deserve to be hurt. That sentence haunted Brad for days afterward. And that was when Brad understood that the feelings between George and Julia even if they had never been acknowledged, had existed for a very long time, like a wound that does not bleed but never truly heals. Maybe they would never say it never crossed that line, but sometimes the things left unsaid are the most dangerous of all. Brad felt as if he were watching a great storm quietly forming one that only the people involved could sense. Pitt still chose silence. But deep inside, he knew an undeniable truth: George Clooney had fallen in love in a way he should not have. And Julia Roberts was the person he had never truly forgotten. In the end, everything still hung in the balance between emotion and choice. George stood between two worlds. On one side, the love he had built with Amal, beautiful but increasingly distant. On the other, the feelings he had for Julia, gentle but full of risk. The smiles on the red carpet, the private moments, all of it became tests he had to face in silence. Brad Pitt, though regretful about the story between Clooney and Amal, still understood that not everything can be controlled. One chapter in life had closed, leaving behind memories that were both sweet and painfully sharp. And the only thing Brad truly hoped was that George would keep the most precious thing of all, the ability to love and be loved once more, without hurting himself or the people he cherished. In the heart of Hollywood, there are love stories that do not need a perfect ending, but are still enough to leave people speechless, reflective, and deeply aware of the weight of love. After everything he had quietly observed, and all the years they had spent side by side, Brad Pitt openly shared that it was his marriage to Amal that gave George a reason to grow up, a source of support that helped him understand he needed to live with greater responsibility. Even so, Pitt could not hide the worry in his heart. Lingering wounds and distances too difficult to name can slowly erode any relationship, no matter how beautiful it once was. Through Brad's words, people began to realize that the friendship between him and George was never just about collaborations, trips, or nights of drinking that stretched until dawn. It was a bond built from unfinished confessions, pains they never revealed to the media, and those quiet moments when Pitt recognized that his friend was drowning in turmoil while still trying to keep a smile on his face. Have you ever wondered, when someone has to stand between a love that has been nurtured over many years and a new, deeply compelling emotion, which side the heart will lean toward? Will George Clooney continue protecting the happiness he built with Amal, or will he risk everything for the new feelings he has for Julia Roberts? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for staying with us through the final moments of this emotional story. If you want to keep following along and uncover more of the rare hidden corners behind Hollywood's spotlight, don't forget to leave a comment, share your opinion, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of the stories coming next.